everyone. We're diving back into some entitled people stories. Today, we've got 3 tales of people who felt entitled to things that weren't theirs. A house, free internet for half a decade, and a parking spot that came with a personal valet. One involves an ex-wife who wanted the OP to sell her pre-marriage home to fund a tiny house on her own property. Another, a neighbor who borrowed Wi-Fi during the pandemic and never gave it back. And the last, a woman who treated a garage like her personal parking spot and learned what tow trucks are for. Which one made you the angriest? Stick around until the end. We'll break them down and you can vote in the comments for the best story. Here we go. I'm the evil stepmother because I won't sell my pre-marriage house to fund a tiny home for my husband's ex. I'm 32, married to a 40-year-old man, and between us we have 3 kids. He brought 2 from his previous marriage, and I have 1 from mine. We don't share children together. He's been divorced for about 10 years, and his ex lives roughly 20 minutes away with their kids under a shared custody arrangement. The children are with us every other weekend and during school breaks, and for the most part, that setup worked fine in the beginning. From day one, though, his ex had a certain tone with me. Nothing explosive, just constant little digs. She'd comment that I work too much, compare my marriage to hers, and imply that she and my husband had some deeper bond I wouldn't understand. At one point, I finally told her, calmly but firmly, that her relationship with him had ended a decade ago and it was time to move forward. My husband backed me up, and she cooled it for a while. I never believed she was truly over him. She hasn't held a job in 15 years after being fired and has relied heavily on child support and extended custody time to maintain her lifestyle. Recently, she was diagnosed with MS, which is serious and not something I take lightly. But since the diagnosis, her behavior escalated. She started asking my husband to attend doctor's appointments for support, requesting rides because she didn't feel safe driving, and tagging along when we took the kids out. She has a boyfriend, by the way. He's fully capable of driving her places. Yet somehow my husband became her default emergency contact for everything. It felt less like co-parenting and more like she was trying to slide back into the center of his life. The guilt factor was constant. "You made vows to me first," she once said, as if chronology meant permanence. Then came the suggestion that broke my patience. She began telling my husband she didn't feel well enough to care for the kids long term. Instead of offering to let them live primarily with us, which I was open to, she presented a different plan. She suggested I sell my house, the house I bought before I ever met him, downgrade to something smaller, and build her a tiny home on our property so she could live nearby for support. When my husband brought this up to me, I was stunned. "Why exactly am I selling my house?" I asked. He didn't have a solid answer. Some of his family chimed in, saying I didn't need such a big house anyway. Apparently, my home had become a community asset without my knowledge. I told him flat out that wasn't happening. That house is an investment I plan to pass down to my child one day. I offered again to have the kids live primarily with us if she truly couldn't manage. She refused, saying she didn't trust us to raise them but wanted to stay close. In other words, she didn't want to relinquish control. She wanted proximity and support. My husband admitted he felt pressured. His father had been absent growing up, and she regularly threatened to limit his access to the kids. She even once refused to let them attend our wedding unless she was invited too. The manipulation has been ongoing, and he's terrified of being labeled a deadbeat. I finally told him this had to stop. "You are not her placeholder," I said. "You are my husband." I insisted he call her in front of me and set boundaries. To his credit, he did. On speakerphone, he told her he would no longer be attending appointments or running errands, and that the tiny house idea was off the table. She immediately accused me of being insecure and interfering with their healthy co-parenting. She called me immature and suggested I should think about their kids first. That's when I stepped in. I told her she needed to focus on her own relationship and support system and stop trying to freeload off ours. I acknowledged her diagnosis, but made it clear we would not be restructuring our lives around her convenience. She started crying mid-conversation, claimed she felt faint, and announced she needed to go to the emergency room before hanging up and blocking both of us. I followed up with a detailed email outlining boundaries and copied all relevant parties, including his parents. If she wanted drama, she could have it documented. I was furious, but also strangely relieved. For once, everything was out in the open. To be clear, I understand MS is a serious condition. I helped her apply for government subsidies when she was diagnosed. I've been compassionate for years. What I won't do is sell my home so she can park herself on my land and continue manipulating my husband under the banner of illness. My husband agreed afterward that he should never have entertained the idea. He admitted the guilt had clouded his judgment. We've agreed that co-parenting communication will be strictly about the kids moving forward. No rides, no appointments, no emotional dependency. If that makes me selfish in some people's eyes, so be it. Compassion doesn't mean surrendering your boundaries. My house is not up for auction because someone else refuses to stand on their own 2 feet. Compassion without boundaries is just being a resource. You helped with applications, you offered to take the kids full-time. You did the compassionate thing for years. What she wanted wasn't compassion, it was control dressed up as need. You said no. That's not selfish. That's just finally drawing a line. And our second story. Some people borrow sugar. This woman borrowed internet for half a decade and had the nerve to call me cheap when I unplugged it. I own a handful of rental apartments. Nothing massive, just enough to keep me busy on weekends and occasionally test my patience. Today, one of my longtime tenants moved out, so I went over to do the usual inspection, collect the keys, and handle the paperwork. This particular tenant had been with me for years and had always been solid. Rent on time, no drama, no damage. The kind of person landlords secretly hope will just stay forever. When I arrived, the unit was spotless. Boxes gone, floor swept, cupboards wiped down. Honestly, the walkthrough felt more like a formality than an inspection. The only thing left behind was the internet modem sitting on the kitchen counter. Years ago, before this tenant moved in, I had a family member living there, and I set up the internet under my name. When Moose, yes, I'll call him Moose because he genuinely resembles the Moose from Archie Comics, moved in back in 2018, we decided to just keep the existing service active. We added $50 to his rent to cover it, and that was that. It saved everyone the hassle of setting up a new account. Now that he was leaving, I planned to cancel the service and return the hardware. I unplugged the modem and coiled the cables while Moose and I walked through the apartment, checking off items on the inspection sheet. His phone buzzed a few times and rang once, but he politely ignored it while we were talking. Then there was a knock at the door. That caught us both off guard. I'd scheduled a viewing for later that afternoon, but nobody had buzzed up yet. Moose opened the door to find the next-door neighbor standing there. Let's call her Veronica. There was some light small talk about him moving out and where he was headed next, but her eyes kept drifting toward the modem on the counter. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, would it be okay to plug that back in? I was actually using it. Moose and I both stared at her. Using what? He asked. The Wi-Fi, she said, as though that explained everything. Apparently, back in early 2020, when the pandemic hit and everyone went remote, she had some issues with her own internet service. She asked Moose if she could temporarily connect to his Wi-Fi until hers was sorted out. Moose, being the easygoing guy he is, said sure. Temporary, as it turns out, lasted more than 5 years. At some point during the pandemic, she canceled her own internet entirely and had been running her entire household off that modem ever since. Work laptop, smart TV, phone, everything. And now that I'd unplugged it, she was cut off. It's Friday, she said, visibly anxious. I need it for work and through the weekend. I'll sort it out on Monday, I promise. Moose looked at me, unsure what to say. I was equally surprised. The connection was high-speed and clearly robust enough that neither of us ever noticed the extra traffic. The billing cycle had just renewed mid-month, so technically the service was paid up for a couple more weeks. 5 years. She used someone else's Wi-Fi for 5 years, canceled her own service, and never thought to mention it until the modem got unplugged. That's not borrowing, that's just living in someone else's house electronically. In the middle of this awkward standoff, the buzzer rang. The prospective tenants had arrived. They came up, and in a strange twist of coincidence, Veronica recognized the woman immediately. Betty, oh my gosh, you're looking at this place? We go to the same Pilates studio. Within seconds, Veronica was enthusiastically selling the building to Betty. It'd be so fun if you moved in. We could go to class together. Then she pivoted back to the modem. What if I just take it to my place? I'll call Shaw and transfer it over. It's already working. I wasn't convinced it'd be that simple, but frankly, if she wanted to deal with the cable company instead of me, that sounded like a blessing. We agreed she could take the equipment temporarily, provided she sorted out the account properly and returned it if necessary. She left with the modem in hand like she'd just secured a hostage exchange. A few minutes later, I got a text. It's working. Thank you so much. After the viewing wrapped up, I called Shaw and explained the situation. I canceled the service effective at the end of the billing cycle. That gives her a couple of weeks to open her own account. Either they'll migrate the equipment over or swap it out for new hardware. Either way, the account will no longer be tied to me. During the conversation, she'd made a comment that I still can't decide was a joke or audacity on full display. Oh, come on, don't be cheap, she'd said with a little laugh when we hesitated about plugging it back in. Cheap. After she'd been quietly siphoning internet service for half a decade. The irony was almost impressive. To be clear, Moose wasn't upset. He genuinely hadn't noticed, and the extra rent he paid covered the service anyway. I wasn't financially hurt by it, but the entitlement of assuming it would just continue indefinitely was wild. There had been zero attempt to formalize it, no offer to split the bill, no mention of canceling her own service until today. In the end, it worked out conveniently. I didn't have to return the modem myself, and she got a brief grace period to get her life sorted. But I have to admire the confidence it takes to walk into someone else's apartment on move-out day and ask them to turn your 5-year free ride back on. Some people borrow a cup of sugar. Others apparently borrow broadband for half a decade and call you stingy when you unplug it. That's the part that stays with you. Not the 5 years of free internet, but the way she acted like you were being unreasonable for taking it back. She built her whole household on borrowed service and somehow made you the bad guy for canceling it. That's a special kind of confidence. And our last story. The tow truck driver didn't care about her tone. Years ago, I moved into a small apartment building in a neighborhood where parking was basically a competitive sport. The building had 10 units total, 8 studios and 2 one-bedrooms, and I had managed to rent one of the one-bedrooms. The real prize, though, was the individual garage assigned to each unit in the alley behind the building. In that area, having a garage wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. On the very day I was moving in, hauling boxes and trying to keep track of what went where, I met my new neighbor, LaCrystal. She lived in a studio on the opposite end of the building and introduced herself by pointing at the space directly in front of my garage. I parked there, she said, as if that settled something important. I paused and looked at the space, then back at her. That's in front of my garage, I said carefully. She shrugged and explained that she had an old, broken-down car stored inside her own garage, so she used the alley space instead. I told her I left for work most mornings at 4 a.m. and needed clear access. Without missing a beat, she handed me her phone number and said, "Just call me and I'll move it." I had a truck full of furniture and no desire to start a feud within 5 minutes of moving in, so I agreed. At first, it seemed manageable. I'd call, she'd come out after a few minutes, and I'd head to work. But it didn't take long for the arrangement to unravel. Soon I was calling and waiting 10 minutes with no sign of her. I'd call again, and she'd answer with irritation dripping from her voice. "I told you I was coming. Damn," she'd snap, as though I was unreasonable for wanting access to my own garage. Some mornings, I felt like I needed to schedule an appointment just to leave for work. And it wasn't just mornings either. There were evenings when I'd come home exhausted and find her car planted in front of my garage again. I'd call, sometimes 3 times, and get sent straight to voicemail. Once I walked up to her unit and could hear her inside laughing and talking while ignoring my calls. That was the moment I realized this wasn't an inconvenience, it was a power play. She turned a favor into an entitlement. You needed to get out at 4 a.m. and suddenly she was the one in charge of your schedule. The laughing while you knocked said it all. This wasn't about parking anymore. After a few weeks of this nonsense, I told her plainly, "You need to stop parking there. This isn't working." She rolled her eyes and said, "It's not that serious." was serious to me, especially when I was circling the block at midnight because she couldn't be bothered to move her car. The property owner happened to be a friend and client of mine, so I finally told him what was going on. He didn't hesitate. Within days, bright signs were posted along the alley stating that vehicles blocking garages would be towed. It was clear, direct, and left no room for interpretation. Of course, that didn't stop her. One night I came home with my girlfriend and saw her car parked in front of my garage again, sign fully visible above it. I called her 3 times, voicemail every time. I walked past her unit and heard her inside complaining about me calling her like she was my personal valet. I went back outside and called a tow truck. They arrived quickly, and within minutes her car was being lifted and hauled away. I parked in my garage and went upstairs without another thought. The next morning while I was at work, my girlfriend called to tell me LaCrystal was outside my window, loudly telling someone on the phone that I had her car towed for no reason and that I owed her $300. When I got home that afternoon, she was waiting in the courtyard with a dramatic smile plastered across her face. "Hello, neighbor," she said in a syrupy tone that didn't match the venom in her eyes. I replied with a simple, "Hey," and went inside. Moments later, she was on the phone again, loudly announcing that I better pay up if I want to keep breathing. The following day, she escalated her intimidation strategy by having a very large guy show up. I'm 6'4" and about 215 pounds, so I'm not exactly small, but this guy was even bigger. For about a week, whenever I stepped outside, he would appear and just stare at me like he was auditioning for a low-budget crime drama. We never exchanged words. I stared back, and eventually the routine lost its effect. I never paid her a dime. A few days later, she blocked someone else's garage and got towed again. This time, I didn't even make the call. The property owner happened to drive by, saw it, and contacted the tow company himself. She assumed it was me, judging by the way she glared whenever she saw me, but I didn't correct her. Over the next couple of months, she or one of her friends got towed several more times for the same stunt. It turned out I wasn't the only tenant tired of playing musical cars in the alley. Eventually, she stopped parking in front of garages altogether. Apparently, repeated tow fees are more persuasive than polite requests. I stayed in that apartment for another year without further drama. Every time I pulled into my garage at 4 a.m. without having to make a phone call first, I felt a quiet satisfaction. All she ever had to do was use her own garage instead of treating mine like overflow parking. Some people only learn boundaries when a tow truck enforces them. 3 people who confused kindness with obligation. The ex-wife spent a decade not getting over her former marriage. She used MS as leverage, demanded rides to appointments, and wanted the OP to sell her pre-marriage house to fund a tiny home on their property. She framed it as support. What she wanted was proximity and control. When the husband finally set boundaries on speakerphone, she faked an emergency and blocked them both. Compassion without boundaries isn't compassion, it's just being used. The second story. The internet neighbor borrowed Wi-Fi during the pandemic and never gave it back. 5 years later, when the modem got unplugged on move-out day, she showed up to demand it be turned back on. She called the owner cheap for hesitating. She'd canceled her own service entirely and built her household on someone else's account. That's not borrowing, that's just living in someone else's house electronically. The parking neighbor treated a favor like a right. She parked in front of someone's garage, made them call and wait, and got annoyed when they needed to leave for work at 4 a.m. When the signs went up, she ignored them. When the calls went to voicemail, she laughed inside her apartment. Then the tow truck came. Then it came again and again. Eventually, she stopped. Some people only learn boundaries when they're enforced by a truck. Which one's the worst? For me, story 3 wins. Not because the entitlement was bigger, it wasn't, but because the response was so clean. No arguments, no negotiations, no drawn-out drama, just signs, a tow truck, and repeat until the behavior stopped. The laughing while someone knocked on her door? That's the kind of detail that makes you glad the tow truck doesn't care about tone. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.